Chapter 1. Whispers in the Stone. The wind howled through the peaks of the World's Edge Mountains, dragging a frigid breath down the narrow clefts and into the halls of Karak Azgalok. Known as the Ember Hall, it had stood for centuries, chiseled into the heart of granite and iron, flickering with the heat of ancient forges and the echo of an unbroken oath. The dwarves of Azgalok were few but proud, and though smaller than the great Karaks of legend, their outpost was no mere holdfast. It was a beacon in the dark, its hearth always lit, its warriors ever watchful. Atop the outermost watchtower the wind keened like a banshee, battering the cloaked form of Rurik Forkbeard, a veteran ranger. Snowflakes clung to his thick beard, now stiff with frost and blood. One hand clutched his axe, the other a blood-stained rune-stamped scroll. His cloak was torn, fletched with goblin arrows. He limped past the gate wardens, spitting red into the snow. "They're comin'," he growled, voice raw like gravel dragged across iron. "Not a raid, a bloody bwog." Inside the Ember Hall, the light of braziers flickered over carved stone columns and ancestral murals, their pigments dulled by time but no less sacred. Dwarves milled in the central chamber, smiths clanging, apprentices hauling crates of black powder, hammering out pickaxes, spearheads, and buckles. It was a living monument of purpose. Seated atop the high seat of Azgalok, clad in stone-engraved armor that had seen 3 wars and outlived 2 kings, Thane Baragor narrowed his eyes beneath thick, iron-gray brows as Rurik staggered in. A hush fell over the chamber. Rurik fell to one knee, presenting the scroll. North Ridge, 5 valleys out, black smoke and drums. Orcs, goblins, squigs the size of boars. They took Karak Azgalok's mining camp. Burnt it, slaughtered everyone, no survivors but me. Drumley took the scroll, eyes scanning the bloodied scrawl. His lips curled into a sour grimace. "You're sure?" Rurik's one good eye flared. "Aye, and they're not wandering aimlessly. They march with banners, tribes united. Something stirring them, Thane. Something big." Drumley grunted. Around him his council murmured. Some clenched fists, others whispered of black orcs, of forgotten deep roads, of old grudges stirring again. But the Thane simply waved his hand, silencing them. "We've heard these tales before," he said, voice ironbound, immovable. "Scouts always say the end's near when the cold sets in, and every time the mountains bury the Greenskins in snow and stone. But this time," Rurik began. "I said enough." Drumley stood, towering for a dwarf, his beard tucked into golden clasps shaped like roaring drakes. "We do not tremble at rumors. Azgalok is not a nest of surface cowards. Let the Greenskins come. We have powder, steel, and rune. Let them break upon us like water on rock." He turned to the assembly. "Double the patrols. Post Ironbreakers at the lower gate, but we do not sound the horn of war until we see the whites of their stinking eyes. I'll not rouse the hold into panic over goblin tracks." Rurik's shoulders slumped. He bowed his head, but his voice carried one last warning. "They're already in the tunnels, Thane. I heard 'em singing. They've got your name in their mouths." Drumley's grip tightened on the haft of his hammer. His knuckles turned pale. For a heartbeat he said nothing. Then, "Let them come." As the chamber returned to work, whispers lingered behind every anvil strike, every steaming mug passed in silence. Dwarves muttered in corners, hands clutching worn amulets of Grimnir and Valea. In the lowest depths, miners sealed off rarely used passages. The air in the Ember Hall grew heavier, not with fear, but anticipation. The stone itself seemed to listen. And somewhere beyond the ridge, far from the forge's light, a guttural cry echoed through a snow-choked canyon. Green bodies moved like ants across the white, blades clashing, squigs shrieking. A great tusked shadow loomed behind the horde, armor rusted, eyes burning yellow. The wog had begun, and Karak Azgalok would soon remember the taste of blood and ash. Chapter 2. Echoes of War. The scent of roasted boar and molten iron mingled in the stone arteries of Karak Azgalok, carried on the steam rising from the forges. It was the eve of the winter festival of ancestors, a time when every dwarf, be they grizzled ironbreaker or soot-streaked apprentice, came together to honor the long-dead forebears whose bones had been buried in the deep crypts of the mountain. Candles burned low in carved skull sconces, and the great mural of Morgrim the Flame-Handed was draped in garlands of mountain holly and brass rune chains. Children scampered with carved wooden axes, mimicking their ancestors' valor. Miners returned from the shafts early, their weary faces brightened by ale and song. The forges glowed like the heart of the mountain itself. Sparks danced like fireflies as smiths struck anvils in time with sacred rhythms. The tapping echoed like distant thunder, an ancestral heartbeat. Grune Stonebraid, stoic and silent, stood watch near the central chamber, his polished gromrel armor glinting in the forge light. His beard, braided tightly with steel rings of his fallen kin, did not stir even as raucous laughter echoed around him. He watched, always watched, like a stone sentinel carved with a soul. "Yer face could curdle stone, Grunny," came a chuckle behind him. Balin Firemantle, shirtless despite the mountain cold, his rune-scarred flesh steaming from his exertions, tossed back a tankard of black ale. His red crest of hair stood like a pyre, and his eyes burned with the hollow light of a slayer's oath. "Better to curdle stone than piss me trousers," Grimney muttered, eyes still forward. Balin grinned. "Don't worry, I'll die first." "Aye," Grunny said flatly, "ye likely will." At the anvil altar near the forge, Hilda Rorikson bent over a flat slab of star metal, her hands dancing in swift, practiced strokes. Rune ink steamed from the heat of the metal, forming the complex web of protective symbols. Her fingers traced the final line of a binding rune as she muttered invocations under her breath, eyes glowing faintly with restrained arcane power. Young apprentices watched her in awe from behind braided veils. "This rune's for protection," she said to them without looking up, "though it won't stop foolishness or beer-fueled brawling. For that your mothers will have to do." A sudden tremor. The floor shifted subtly beneath their feet. For a moment they all paused, unsure if it was another forge hammer strike. Then another tremor, stronger. Candles flickered, else sloshed in mugs. Then the sound came. Dun, 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 dun. Like thunder, only deeper, primal, a rhythm of war. Grunny was the first to move. "That's no hammer song." All merriment died instantly. Mugs hit the ground, smiths dropped tools, children were herded away by elders without a word. Every dwarf in Karak Azgalok felt it in their bones. Drums. Not of dwarves. Not of celebration. War drums. From deep within the mountain. "Lower gate," someone shouted. "The drums are coming from the lower gate." Then came the sound like stone cracking, distant but distinct, a boom, like something had collapsed. Screams followed, muted by distance, but unmistakable in their pitch. The words that followed carried up through the winding halls like smoke through the cracks. "Wow, wag." The cry rose in a tidal wave of savagery and rage, goblin shrieks, orc bellows, the cackling of squigs, a flood of sound and madness. The ancient outpost shook as if the mountain itself roared in pain. "To arms," barked Grunny, already moving toward the war racks. He snapped up his rune shield, its face bearing the sigil of Azgalok, and grabbed his battle-axe. "Seal the forge hall. Get the younglings out." Balin grinned like a madman. "Grimnir hears my oath," he shouted, leaping down the steps, grabbing two wicked axes, their edges freshly sharpened just hours before. "Don't be stupid, Slayer," Hilda called, rolling up her runescope and grabbing a rune-covered warhammer. "The tunnels are narrow. They'll come in waves. We use that." The outpost burst into controlled chaos. Steel boots thundered across stone. Ironbreakers and quarrelers scrambled to the choke points. Trap levers were pulled, and rune mechanisms sealed lesser halls with crashing slabs of stone. Oil was poured into slits, then lit. A wall of flame blossomed across one of the side halls, incinerating the first trickle of goblins that had breached through a forgotten tunnel. But the real horror came next. From the blackness of the lower shaft surged a sea of green flesh. Squigs bounded ahead, gibbering, round-mouthed horrors with more teeth than sense. Behind them, shrieking goblins loosed crude arrows, and among them, lumbering like a brute born of hate and filth, came orcs, massive, scarred, and roaring, smashing into the defensive lines with brutal abandon. The first Ironbreaker to fall was cleaved in two by an orc wielding a jagged cleaver. His shield buckled inward, then his helmet cracked like a kettle under pressure. Blood sprayed the walls. Balin screamed with fury and dove into the fray, axes singing. One squig lunged at him. He drove a blade through its eye and kicked its corpse into the horde, laughing. "More!" he bellowed. "Send me more, ye stinkin' fungus fawn!" Hilda flung runehammers like missiles, each blow bursting into arcs of flame and lightning. Goblins were flung backward, limbs torn from sockets. She muttered curses with every cast, sweat pouring down her brow as the mountain shook again. And above them all, rising through the stone air like a bell tolling doom, the war drums pounded louder. The wag was not coming. It was already here. Chapter 3. The First Breach. The mountain groaned. Not from age or weight, but from the violence tearing at its belly. From the lower tunnels of Karak Azgalok, the sound of war had swelled into a cacophony of death. Screams, war cries, the thunder of boots, and the sickening wet cracks of bodies torn apart. But then, everything paused, just for a breath. A silence thick as oil hung in the air, heavy with tension. Then, the southern gate, an ancient slab of rune-inscribed stone thicker than a castle wall, exploded inward. Not crumbled, not cracked, shattered. A cloud of dust and pulverized rock erupted through the corridor like a sandstorm, swallowing Ironbreakers whole. From within the whiteout came a sound, a grotesque wet bounce, followed by an ear-splitting shriek that echoed off the walls like a daemon's wail. Out of the dust storm hurtled a siege beast, a squig, but unlike any ever seen. Its body was a swollen sphere of muscle and madness, the size of a breaching ram. Rusted armor plates were bolted into its flesh with jagged spikes. Its eyes, huge and gleaming, rolled in opposite directions, and its gaping maw was ringed with saw-like teeth. Upon its back, strapped in with blood-stained chains and madness, rode a goblin warlord, clad in a patchwork of bronze and scavenged bones. He howled with unholy glee, whipping the squig into a frenzy. Iron met flesh. The siege beast crashed into the defensive line like an avalanche of meat. Shields buckled. Dwarves were crushed under its weight. Limbs shattered, ribs caved. One Ironbreaker tried to bring his axe down upon the creature's eye, but the squig's maw snapped up and down like a guillotine, biting the dwarf in half at the waist. Blood sprayed across the rune-lit walls. "Form ranks," bellowed Grunny Stonebraid, his voice thunderous, unyielding. "Bring it down!" Grunny hurled himself forward, shield first, slamming into the squig's flank. The beast bellowed, staggering from the force, but only slightly. Grunny's axe came down in a perfect arc, chopping deep into the beast's knee joint. A gout of black-green ichor sprayed across his armor, sizzling against the rune metal. Beside him, Hilda Rorikson worked frantically, fingers moving in a blur. She knelt in a tight passage between support pillars, etching glowing runes into a copper inlay with her chisel and fire quill. Her muttered incantations fused with the chaos, a low, rhythmic song of magic and fury. "Hold them for 20 more heartbeats," she shouted. 20, and I'll give them fire enough to cook their own bones." Gruni spat blood, then knocked a goblin's teeth out with his shield rim. "If they don't cook us first." The squeak roared again, tail lashing wildly. It crushed a fleeing dwarf against the wall, the sound a wet, meaty pop. The goblin warlord atop it shrieked and hurled black-fletched javelins, one of which buried itself into the throat of a young shield-bearer. The boy gurgled and fell, blood pouring down his mail like wine over stone. The line faltered. The squig reared for another charge. Hilda's runes ignited. Flames spiraled across the copper channels like liquid fire, carving molten veins through the stone floor. As the squig stepped forward, the entire floor beneath it erupted in a contained explosion of flame and rune fire. The blast tore through flesh and armor alike, flinging goblins back in chunks. The siege beast's howl turned to a death wail. It fell, twitching, muscles spasming as its insides boiled from within. The goblin rider was thrown skyward, his body crumpling against a stalactite, impaled like a rag doll. Silence fell again. Brief, horrible. Then the swarm came. Goblins poured into the breach. Dozens. Hundreds. A living tide of filth and rusted steel. They scrambled over the corpses, stabbing, laughing, shrieking in their native tongue. Dwarves screamed. Some dragged down in a swarm of knives. A hammerer had his legs hacked off before he even hit the ground. Gruni led the countercharge. With a roar like an avalanche, he barreled into the green tide. His axe swung in perfect arcs, each blow a death sentence. He cleaved 2 goblins with a single stroke. He kicked another into a wall so hard its skull caved. His shield was a wall, his rage a furnace. Behind him, the Ironbreakers regrouped, rallying around his fury. Hilda, blood streaked across her cheek, raised her hammer, and began laying more traps behind the fallback line. But even as the dwarves held, bodies piled. Grunny stepped over Dern Onetooth, his old shieldmate, whose head had been split down the middle like a log. Nearby, a pair of twins from the forge ward fell back to back, impaled by crude spears, their beards intertwined as they died. Then came the call. From deep within the hall, above the battlefield. Thane Dromley Baragor, helm adorned with fire gems, his warhammer glowing with runes, stood on the stairs of the upper hall. "Fall back! Collapse the lower tunnels!" he commanded. His voice cut through the madness like a war horn. "We hold here and we all die. Lock down the hall." Explosives, already prepared for emergency collapse, were lit. The Ironbreakers began pulling back. Grunny was last, backing up step by step, his shield bearing the blows of frenzied goblins, his axe never ceasing. Hilda ran beside him, throwing a rune beacon into the air, a signal for detonation. Boom. The lower tunnel collapsed in a controlled demolition, drowning hundreds of goblins in smoke, rock, and fire. Screams were silenced in an instant. But so were a dozen dwarves who hadn't made it out. The outpost shuddered again, settling into a grave stillness. Only the crackle of fires and the low moans of the wounded remained. The first breach had come. The dead were too many to count. The stone was soaked with blood, and as the dwarves sealed the doors to the upper halls with layered runes and molten metal, every one of them knew this was only the beginning. Chapter 4. The Hall of the Ancestors. The corridors of Karak Azgalok wept ash and blood. Refugees, smiths, miners, wounded shield-bearers, and children staggered through the inner halls, their faces pale with soot and loss. Mothers clutched babes swaddled in mail, bloodied warriors leaned on axes as crutches. The fires that had once lit the lower halls were extinguished, replaced by the choking haze of smoke and the scent of burned flesh. The upper sanctum, carved into the mountain's heart, was the final bastion. Here stood the Hall of the Ancestors, a colossal chamber flanked by statues of the founding clans, each towering over 20 feet tall, their eyes hollow and watching. Their weapons, granite replicas of real relics, rested across their knees, silent witnesses to every triumph and tragedy of the Ember Hall. Braziers burned low between them, their coals fed by sacred flame carried from the eternal forge before its fall. A heavy silence blanketed the hall. Thane Baragor stood at the foot of the great ancestral throne, flanked by his remaining captains. His beard was singed, armor scratched and blackened, but his eyes, those steel-gray coals, burned with clarity and command. He leaned on his rune hammer as if the weight of the mountain pressed down on his back, and perhaps it did. The last warriors stood before him, grunny, battered and bloodied, his shield now more dent than steel. Hilda, her runes cracked, hands shaking from magical overuse, and Balin Firemantle, smiling like a wolf. "Half the tunnels are gone," Drumley said, his voice low but unwavering. "But the bastards are clever. They're finding cracks, burrowing like lice. If they reach the high forges or the crypt tunnels, we're finished." He gestured to a stone map carved into the floor, rune-marked paths glowing faintly. "We need to delay them here, here, and here," he said, pointing to 3 secondary tunnels winding beneath storage halls and ancestral catacombs. "Caves that narrow," Grunmi said, grim, "are too tight for a full squad." "Exactly," Dromley replied. "We need speed, precision, sacrifice." Silence. Then came the rasp of iron across stone. Balin stepped forward. "I'll do it," he said, almost casually, spinning an axe across his palm. "Collapse the bastards under their own filth." "Alone?" Grunny grunted. "I don't plan to come back," he smiled. "I'll take enough of them with me to make Grimnir proud." Dromley stared at him. "You're sure?" Balin cracked his neck. "A slayer lives for death, but I'll make it sing." Hilda stepped forward, face drawn. "I'll give you 3 rune bombs. Each will bring the mountain down if placed right. But they're unstable. If you drop one—" "I hope I drop one," Balin said with a mad grin. "Might be more fun that way." He turned to the others. "Don't mourn me. Just sing loud when it's done." They clasped arms, Croony silent but fierce, Hilda pressing the bombs into his scarred hands. Drumley gave a slow nod. "Make it count." Hours later, Tunnel 9A, the smelter vein. Balin moved like a wraith through the dark, footsteps silent despite his heavy boots. The glow of his torch danced along soot-stained walls and past ancient support beams, etched with warning runes. Above, the stone groaned, a living weight ready to crush. He stopped at the first choke point. Ahead, flickering torchlight, goblin voices, giggling, sniffing, the stink of rot and filth. He pulled a rune bomb from his pouch, a dull bronze disc etched with angry red glyphs. Hilda's runes pulsed with a heartbeat. He whispered a prayer, not to be spared, but to die properly. Then he screamed, "Come on, you groby bastards." A horde of goblins turned the corner, dozens of them shrieking and snarling. Balin hurled the bomb down the corridor and charged. The explosion turned the narrow tunnel into a fiery hell. Stone collapsed in sheets, crushing squigs and goblins alike. Balin didn't stop. His axes danced through the smoke, hacking limbs, severing necks, biting into rib cages. Blood sprayed the walls in wild arcs. A goblin lunged. He caught it midair and snapped its spine over his knee. He laughed, mad, joyous. By the time the next horde arrived, he was already at the second tunnel. Another bomb, another charge. More screams. Goblins burned alive, howling as molten rock poured from the broken ceilings. Balin fought in silhouette against the fire, nothing more than a whirl of orange hair and gleaming blades. He was a god of death in a tunnel of flame. By the third collapse he was soaked in blood, his own and theirs. He stood in the center of the last choke point, heaving, chest pierced by arrows, leg shredded by a squig bite. He could barely lift his axe. The last rune bomb trembled in his hand. The Greenskins saw him then, 20 of them, blades raised, frothing for the kill. He grinned. "You'll have to earn it, ye filthy shites." And then he roared, the rune bomb glowing in his palm. The ceiling came down. Fire, stone, blood, silence. Back in the Hall of the Ancestors, the mountain shook once more. Dromla looked up from his map. No words were spoken, but every dwarf in the room stood a little straighter. They would remember the name Balin Firemantle until the end of the world. Chapter 5. Balin's Last Roar. The narrow pass they chose was known as Grimnir's Teeth, a jagged tunnel of natural stone ridges, chiseled only minimally to allow dwarves to pass in single file. The roof arched high, spiked with obsidian spears and pressure cracks. One good collapse would bury anything inside in a stone grave with no sky and no salvation. Balin Firemantle stood at its mouth, flanked by 5 volunteers, 5 warriors who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. They bore no names now, only oaths. Dwarves whose families had been buried beneath the lower halls. One had no eye, another walked with a limp, but each gripped their axes with bloodied fists. Balin looked them over. He didn't smile this time. "This is it," he said. "We fight like devils. We bleed till we can't. Then we bring the mountain down on the lot of them. Die with your axes swinging and your teeth bared." No one answered. They simply nodded. It was enough. They set the trap just beyond the bend of the pass, a line of black powder barrels scavenged from the lower stores, covered with rubble and soaked in oil. Hilda's final rune bomb sat embedded into the central beam, waiting, pulsing faintly with a cruel red glow. All it needed was a final strike. The bait was them. The goblins came like rats, chasing the smell of blood. It started with a scream. A dwarf's war cry echoed from the pass, then a wet crunch. They came in swarms, squealing, blades raised, riding nipping squigs, gnashing and howling. They saw dwarfs retreating into the narrow pass just ahead, injured, vulnerable. They bit the bait. Hundreds poured in. The pass became a charnel house. The first wave met Balin's axe. He came at them like a furnace, his red crest streaked with soot and gore, axes a blur of steel and madness. He caught one goblin under the jaw and split its skull through the top. He buried his second axe in a squig's eye, then kicked its dying body into a knot of goblins. The others followed, silent, grim, relentless. The pass gave them no room to swarm. It was axe work, close, dirty, intimate. A dwarf screamed as a rusted sword split his thigh. He fell, but even from the ground he severed a goblin's ankle and laughed as they fell together. Another was pierced through with 3 spears, yet kept swinging, felling 2 more before they dragged him down under a wave of teeth and knives. Balin didn't falter. He moved like a berserker prophet, every strike a sermon, every scream a hymn to Grimnir. But they were too many. He watched the last of his comrades fall, one crushed by a squig, another gutted and thrown like a rag. Blood slicked the stone, coating Balin's boots. His breath came ragged. His left arm hung limp, broken. His right axe was gone, lodged in the throat of a black orc that had refused to die quietly. Still, he stood. The goblins halted, sensing something wrong. He turned to the support beam. The rune bomb glowed brighter now, waiting. Balin planted his boots in the gore-soaked stone, gripped the haft of his remaining axe, and looked at the sea of filth pouring into the pass. Then, with a roar that cracked the stone itself, "You want me? Come take me." The sound shook the tunnel. The goblin screamed back, charging blindly, and Balin swung. The axe came down on the rune bomb, splitting it in half. The world ignited. The mountains screamed. The explosion tore through the pass with a sound like the gods breaking chains. The ceiling collapsed in thunderous sheets of rock and fire. The obsidian spires above shattered and fell like teeth, impaling squigs, goblins, and dwarves alike. A pressure wave blew outward, throwing stone shrapnel down the tunnel. The flames roared red and orange, swallowing everything in a flash of annihilation. The tunnel sealed itself, nature reclaiming what it had loaned. No goblin made it out. No dwarf either. Only silence followed. Only dust. Back in the Hall of the Ancestors, the rumble reached them. A tremor that knocked goblets from tables, shook dust from ancient carvings, and made the forglights flicker. Everyone froze. Dromley didn't move. Hilda, standing at the edge of the council steps, clenched a rune desk in her hand so tightly it cracked. Granny looked toward the stone, then nodded once. No words were spoken, but a legend had just been born, and the mountain mourned. Chapter 6. The Rune of Binding. The fires in the Hall of the Ancestors burned low, flickering against the solemn, bloodied faces of those who remained. Balin's sacrifice had bought them precious time, but not salvation. Already, scouts reported the Greenskins regrouping, pounding at the lesser gates, sniffing out the tunnels like vermin smelling a wounded beast. At the heart of the war council stood Hilda Rorickson, her fingers stained with rune ink and dried blood, eyes sunken from days without sleep. She spread a cracked iron tablet across the stone table, its surface etched with dense, swirling runes, each one humming faintly with restrained power. "This," she said, voice hoarse, "is the rune of binding, a last measure, a ritual once used to seal a daemon within a vault of flame and steel." She looked out. "I'll turn it on the Greenskins, trap them, bury them, burn them in the mountain's womb." Murmurs, fear, respect. "It needs a rune forge," she continued. "A living one, not these relic altars we pray over. I need the anvil Agora Azul, the last ember. Deep in the lower forge." Dromley grimaced. "That forge fell when the squigs poured through the deep shaft. It's ash and corpses now." "I'll make it burn again," she said. "Not alone," came a gravel voice. Groony Stonebraid stepped forward, armor still streaked with black ichor, his shield warped from the last skirmish. "I go with her." "No," Hilda started. "You need time. I'll buy it. My shield still holds." Dromley looked at them both, and saw in their eyes the same fire he'd once carried in his youth. "So be it," he said. "Go, and let your names be etched with fire." The descent. The route to the lower forge was a ruin, a broken throat in the mountain, where heat and death clung to every stone. Grunny led the way, torch in one hand, axe in the other. Hilda followed, rune pouch slung across her chest, the cracked iron tablet clutched tightly. They passed bodies, dwarves half melted into their own armor, goblins blackened to husks, mouths still frozen in shrieks of agony. The walls sweated heat. The air shimmered. Ahead, the red glow of the last ember flickered. The anvil of Garazul stood like a heartstone, still pulsing with the mountain's fury. Fire flowed in rivers around it, casting the chamber in a furious glow. Hilda rushed forward, setting her tools, chanting under her breath in the ancient tongue. She placed the rune of binding atop the anvil, her hands a blur of runes and flame. Sparks leapt with each word, the stone trembled. Groony stood watch at the entrance, breath slow, eyes fixed on the dark tunnel beyond. Then, dramas. Low. Bestial. The roar of something massive. The passage beyond erupted in howls as Greenskins surged forth, not in packs, but as a horde, shields, blades, spears, and squeals. At their center lumbered a monster in black iron. Gosnik Skaldrinka, a black orc warboss clad in jagged plate carved from dwarven tombs, his shoulders hunched with muscle, jaw pierced with bone rings. His eyes glowed yellow, burning with simple, relentless hate. Gruni raised his shield. "Get it done," he said. Then he charged. The battle for time. Gruni met the first goblin mid-stride. His axe cleaved the creature from shoulder to spine, spraying black blood across the stone. He slammed his shield into another, pulping its skull with a crack that echoed through the forge. But then Gorznak came. The warboss swung a slab-like cleaver, a chunk of metal etched with glyphs stolen from dwarven graves. Gruni ducked the blow, the edge shearing sparks from the wall behind him, and countered with a strike to Gorznik's knee. It bit deep, but not deep enough. Gorznak bellowed, spit flying, and brought down his cleaver again, this time catching Grunya's shield. The force shattered it like rotted wood. Grunya was thrown back, ribs cracking against stone. But he got up. "Come on, ye tusked bastard," he hissed, eyes bleeding rage. Hilda, at the anvil, shouted over the chaos. "I need 2 more runes." Gruni stumbled forward, dodging another cleave, and sank his axe into Gorznak's elbow. The warboss roared, black blood spraying as the arm twitched. Gruni paid for it. Gorznak grabbed him by the throat and slammed him into the wall, again and again. Bone cracked. Vision blurred. But Gruni didn't stop fighting. With his last ounce of strength, he drew a rune blade from his belt, short, curved, sacred, and plunged it into Gorznak's armpit, deep under the joint. The warboss reeled back, howling. Gruni fell to one knee, vision swimming. The binding. Hilda screamed the final incantation and slammed her palms into the rune of binding. The forge erupted in a column of fire that coiled around the anvil like a living serpent. It spread in arcs, along the walls, through the tunnels, across the floor. Each rune burst into life, glowing white-hot. Goblins froze mid-step, screeching in terror as their flesh ignited. The very stone screamed, echoing with the fury of ancient craft. Gorznak turned to flee, but the flames coiled around him, dragging him back with chains of light. He thrashed, bellowed, his armor melting into his flesh. His final roar shook the mountain. Then his body exploded in a cloud of molten steel and bone shards. The fire consumed everything. Gruni collapsed beside the anvil, flesh scorched, beard half gone, but alive. Hilda dropped beside him, drained, tears carving clean lines through the soot on her face. They had done it. The horde was broken, sealed in a tomb of fire and rune. But the cost had only begun. Chapter 7. Clash beneath the forge. The lower forge blazed like the core of the world. Flames danced along the ancient runes carved into the obsidian walls, casting monstrous shadows. The smell was unbearable, scorched meat, burning leather, molten stone. The rune of binding pulsed like a second sun, growing brighter with every heartbeat, every word Hilda chanted. She stood hunched over the anvil of Gorazul, sweat dripping from her brow, hair singed, and hands trembling as she carved the final containment symbols into the stone. Behind her, the world was war. The surviving goblins had gone mad with panic as the runes lit up. But the black orcs, larger, meaner, born for slaughter, charged headlong into the flame-lit ruin. And Gruni Stonebraid met them. He stood alone at the breach, a living wall of steel and fury. His shield was gone, shattered to splinters by Gorznak's last blow. His left arm hung limp, broken at the elbow. Blood flowed freely from a deep gash along his scalp, soaking his beard into a matted, crimson curtain. But his axe still sang. The first black orc came at him with a hammer the size of a tombstone. Grony sidestepped, drove his axe up under the brute's chin, and tore through its skull. Brain matter sprayed the anvil wall. The corpse fell twitching at his feet. Another swung low. He caught the blow with his ribs, heard them crack like kindling, and responded with a brutal counter that hacked the orc's leg off at the hip. The beast screamed as it collapsed. Grony crushed its head beneath his boot, teeth gritted in pure hate. "Move faster, girl," he barked, his voice more growl than speech. "Almost there," Hilda cried, frantically tracing the final arc. The rune matrix was incomplete. If she rushed, it could unravel. They would die in fire, and the horde would live. Grundy fought harder. A pair of orcs came at him, one with a flail, the other a jagged axe. He let the flail crash against his shoulder, felt bones snap, didn't care. He spun into the swing, using the momentum to cleave the axeman from collarbone to groin. Guts spilled across the stone. The other screamed. Grunny rammed his axe into the orc's mouth and kept pushing until the handle cracked teeth and wedged in bone. But then, a roar. Gorsnak's Skulldrinker charged through the firestorm like a beast unbound. His black armor ran with molten metal, his skin blistered and steaming. One horned pauldron had melted entirely off, revealing raw, oozing muscle. His eyes were aflame, not with fear, but hatred. He wanted to kill. Grony squared up, feet wide, knuckles white. The war boss struck. The cleaver came in a diagonal sweep, screaming through the air. Grony dodged, barely. The blade carved a deep trench in the wall, stone exploding outward. Grony countered, axe to ribs. It bounced off Gorsnak's armor. The war boss punched him square in the gut, lifting the Ironbreaker off his feet. Grony slammed against the anvil wall, blood erupting from his mouth. He landed in a heap, vision swimming. "Grunny!" Hilda shrieked, almost breaking the final line of the rune. "Don't you stop," he rasped, spitting blood. "You finish it." Gorsnak raised the cleaver again. Grony, with nothing left, threw his axe. It buried itself in Gorsnak's eye socket. The orc reeled, roaring in agony, cleaver dropping from his fingers. Hilda struck the last line of the rune. The anvil detonated with a scream of magic and molten fury. The explosion wasn't fire, it was binding. Runes burst into light, spiraling outward in rings of white gold. They wrapped around Gorsnak like chains of sunlight, dragging him toward the forge. He fought, pulled, thrashed, but the runes burned into his flesh, boiling muscle, fusing bone. He was screaming as he sank, legs first, into the molten stone of the forge chamber. His clawed hands clutched the edge, blackened to bone. He died, still roaring. Then, only the sound of cooling stone and cracking flame. Grunny lay on his back, his body shattered, blood pooling beneath him. Hilda stumbled over, falling to her knees beside him. His breath rattled. "That was a good axe throw," she whispered. "Hey," he rasped. "But your rune was better." He reached with trembling fingers to his belt and unclasped a silver crest, etched with the sigil of Clan Stonebraid. "Take it," he said, pressing it into her hand. "I can't shield no more, but maybe you can." Tears streamed down her face. I'm no Ironbreaker." "You are now." His hand went still. Grony Stonebraid, shield of Azgalok, fell silent. Hilda sat in the blood and flame, clutching the crest to her chest. Behind her, the rune fire still glowed in the stone, and the war paused, but only for a moment. Chapter 8. Dromley Stand. The once proud halls of Karak Azgalok now smelled of death and oil. Ash choked the upper tunnels. The screams from the lower deeps had long gone silent, buried beneath tons of fallen rock. Every surviving dwarf, smith, soldier, apprentice, and elder had gathered in the throne hall, the final chamber of the Ember Hall. No more fallback points, no more escape tunnels. This was the end. The hall stretched like a cathedral of stone and flame. Massive statues of the founding Thanes loomed over the assembled warriors, their visages cracked and blackened from the heat and tremors of battle. Tattered banners of gold and crimson hung in silence. Blood pooled in the joints of the stone floor, soaking into centuries-old etchings. Only 73 dwarves remained. Children were gone, evacuated before the lower forge's fall. What stood now were the last defenders of Azgalok. At the head of the hall sat the high seat, a towering granite throne backed by a mosaic of the ancestors themselves, axes raised, halos of flame and hammerlight behind their heads. Upon the steps before it knelt Thane Dromli Baragor. 2 squires helped him don his ancestral armor, a masterwork of rune-carved gromrol, passed down through 23 generations. His beard was braided into the twin serpent knots of the stone wardens. His breastplate bore the sigil of the ember flame, its orange enamel flaking from heat. Upon his brow rested the helm of Baragor the Unyielding, a helm crowned with gold-streaked horns and 2 rubies burning like coals. In his hands he cradled the warhammer Hondrak, an heirloom forged in the fires of Karak, its head engraved with runes of vengeance and wrath. When he lifted it, the haft hummed with weight and memory. He rose. The room fell silent. Dromli's voice, though hoarse from days of command and smoke, echoed off the stone, like the mountain itself speaking. "They are coming, you can hear them, can't you?" And they could. From far beyond the sealed main gate, the Greenskins were gathering, clambering through the ash-choked ruins, following the trail of blood and broken stone. Their drums returned. Dun-dun, dun-dun, dun-dun. Louder, closer, inevitable. "But listen to me now," Dromli said. "Listen with your bones." He stepped forward, each bootfall a thunderclap. "They may take our hold. They may grind down our gates, butcher us in these halls and piss on our ancestors' bones." He lifted Hondrak high. "But they will not take our honor." A roar met his words. Axes thumped against shields. Voices cried out in defiance. "Let them come," he bellowed. "We'll make them earn every inch. We'll drown them in their own filth and choke them on our steel." He pointed the warhammer toward the gates. "This hall is no tomb. It is a crucible, and we are the last blade it will forge." He turned to Hilda, standing beside him in blackened robes, clutching Grunty's Ironbreaker crest. "You've lit the last runes. You've bound the flame. Now hold it with me." She nodded, eyes filled with grief and fire. Dromli's eyes swept the room. "For Grunyi, for Balin, for every name etched on these walls, for Azgalok." The room erupted, and the gate falls. The final gate, a titanic slab of reinforced stone and steel, shook as something on the other side rammed it. Dust spilled from the arch, another impact, then a third, followed by a cracking sound like a tree splitting. Then it shattered. A wave of greenskins surged through the breach, squigs frothing, goblins screaming, orcs roaring. They were met by a wall of dwarves. Crossbow bolts punched through the first ranks. Oil was hurled into the breach and lit. A curtain of fire engulfed the doorway, but the horde kept coming, screaming through the flames. Dromli led the charge. He swung Hondrak into the face of the first orc, a blow so fierce it caved the skull inward, shattering bone like eggshell. He twisted and brought the hammer back, slamming it into a goblin's chest with a sickening crunch. The dwarves fought like berserkers. One was dragged down and eviscerated by a pack of squigs, his screams high and wet. Another, bearded and blind in one eye, hurled himself into a group of goblins with dynamite strapped to his chest. The explosion took a dozen with him, spraying entrails across the mosaic floor. Hilda stood atop the steps, casting rune words from a broken tome, each one flashing out like a whip of lightning. A group of goblins rushed her. She crushed them beneath a wave of rune force that split their bones and boiled their flesh from within. Still they came. The horde did not care for glory. It wanted blood. Drumley was bleeding from half a dozen wounds, one eye nearly swollen shut. His beard had caught fire. He was laughing, a deep, wild sound. The troll barreled into the line, swinging a spiked club the size of a tree trunk. Drumley met it head-on. The troll's swing shattered the ground. Drumley ducked under it, drove Hrondrak into its kneecap, and shattered the joint. The creature collapsed, shrieking, and Drumley brought the hammer down into its skull until it caved like wet clay. The throne hall filled with smoke, fire, and screams. But the dwarfs held. And at the top of the hall, beneath the mosaic of the ancestors, Drunli stood tall, wounded, scorched, surrounded by corpses. And unbroken. Chapter 9. The Last Ember. They came like a flood, black and green and endless. Through the shattered gate of the throne hall, Greenskins poured, climbing over their own dead, shrieking war cries that bounced from the stone walls like 1,000 curses. Squigs bounded on grotesque, muscular legs, jaws wide and slavering. Goblins scampered ahead, stabbing, clawing, dying by the dozen. Behind them, black orcs moved like battering rams in armor, their axes heavy as anvils. The dwarves of Karak Azgalok, fewer than 50 now, formed a half-circle around the steps of the high seat, back to back, bloodied, panting, unbroken. The floor was slick with gore, so thick it squelched beneath boots. Dwarven corpses lay in pieces, eyes staring in eternal defiance. The banners of the Ember Hall were torn, burning at the edges. From the walls, the statues of the ancestors watched in silence, cracked and scorched by stray fire. And atop the throne steps stood Thane Baragor, soaked in blood not all his own, one arm hanging uselessly at his side. His beard was ragged, his breath wheezed through cracked ribs. But Hrondrak, the ancient warhammer, still glowed with rune light. He had become a monument of defiance, standing where kings before him had ruled in peace. The last fight begins. The Greenskins surged again. Dramlir didn't wait. He charged down the steps with a bellow that shook loose stones from the rafters. He met the first wave head-on, Hrondrak crashing through skulls, splintering bones like rotted branches. A goblin leapt at him. He caught it mid-air and slammed it into the stone so hard its spine burst through its chest. Beside him, Hilda stood barefoot on the blood-slick floor, robes in tatters, face smeared with soot and streaked tears. She hurled rune flames from her palms, every cast fueled by grief and desperation. Her spells exploded through the horde. One ball of fire engulfed a black orc entirely, setting its armor to melt, and its skin to peel like bark. She screamed the names of the dead as she fought. For Gruni, for Balin, for Azgalok. Each name another rune, another weapon, another soul-lending power to the spell. A troll barged through the flames, its body blackened but still moving, eyes wild with hunger. It reached for her. Drumley stepped between them. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. He simply raised Hrondrak and brought it down with every last ounce of strength. The troll's skull imploded, a sickening crunch followed by the thud of its body collapsing in a heap of twitching muscle and shattered bone. He turned, breathing like a forge bellows. "Still with me, lass?" Hilda nodded, chest heaving. "Aye," she whispered, "still burning." One by one. But even fire needs fuel. The dwarves fell like stars, each blaze snuffed in agony. One was torn apart by 3 squigs, his screams pealing until his throat burst. Another lost his footing on the blood-slick stone, only to be hacked to pieces by goblins who danced in his entrails. A shield maiden fought until her arm was severed, then continued with her teeth, before she was overwhelmed and gutted where she stood. 20, 15, 10. The last of them gathered on the throne steps, bleeding and silent. Behind them, Hilda collapsed to her knees, her magic spent, her flesh trembling. Dromli put a hand on her shoulder, not as a Thane, but as a kin. It's time. The Runesmiths. At the back of the throne, half hidden behind a carved pillar, was a rune-inscribed lever, the Fail Sigil, designed in ancient times when every dwarf stronghold was built not just to endure, but to deny. It connected to the load-bearing plates in the mountain above, charged with seismic rune energy. It would bring it all down, the throne room, the upper halls, the ceiling itself. Everything. Dromli looked to the last few standing, barely breathing, blood caking their armor. No graves, he said, but they'll find our bones wrapped around axe hafts, not shackled. He turned to Hilda. Take my crest. Live if you can. She shook her head. I'll hold here, she said, like you taught me. Dromli nodded. And then, without ceremony, he limped to the lever. The Greenskins howled their victory. They flooded into the hall, hundreds now. Their boots splashed through blood, their eyes gleamed with hate. One goblin, perched on a troll's back, screamed in triumph. Then Dromli pulled the lever. A deep, ancient groan echoed through the mountain. The rune lines across the walls ignited in crimson light, glowing like magma. The ceiling above cracked with a boom. Dust fell like snow. The Greenskins paused. Too late. The throne hall collapsed. Massive slabs of stone fell from above, crushing orcs in mid-charge, splitting goblins like insects, squigs screeching before being buried under tons of debris. One troll tried to flee, only to be pinned beneath a fallen pillar, its back shattered, its guts sprang out in a wet squelch. Dromli stood tall as the first stone hit him, cracking his spine, forcing him to one knee. Still, he kept pulling. He dragged the lever with both hands as the hall imploded. Finally, a monolith of granite came down from the rafters and buried him, throne and all. The last thing heard was his voice, deep and steady. For honor. Silence. Then dust. Then stillness. The Ember Hall was gone, and with it the last light of Karak Azgalok. Chapter 10. Songs in the Stone. The World's Edge Mountains brooded beneath a blanket of snow, their crags biting at the sky, their chasms lost in shadow. Storms whispered down the passes, and wolves howled at dusk like they remembered something terrible. Far beneath the wind and ice, past landslides and buried trails, a group of dwarven adventurers stood at the mouth of a shattered tunnel, one long swallowed by time and grief. Their leader, a young ranger captain named Baron Stouthammer, held up a dimly glowing rune lantern, its blue light casting long shadows across the broken keystones. "This is it," he muttered. "Karak Azgalok, the Ember Hall." Behind him, 6 others, veteran shield brothers, engineers, and a pair of rune students, gazed into the collapsed entrance like it might breathe. They'd followed half-remembered trails, broken charts, and a whisper in the archives of Karak that said a flame once burned here, brighter than gold, then died in silence. Baron touched the stone archway, fingers running across old scorch marks and deep claw gouges. The scent of burned iron and old blood still lingered in the rock. The descent. It took days to dig through the collapsed front tunnel, hauling stone and ash out bucket by bucket, supporting the ceiling with fresh beams, carving a safe passage. Even the air felt old, thick with memory. On the 5th day, they broke through into a wide shaft, collapsed but passable. The team descended, torches flickering against soot-stained walls. They passed bones, armor twisted into grotesque shapes, and shattered weapons embedded in the floor. Everywhere, death. But then they found it, beyond a cracked arch supported by fire-blackened columns. The Hall of the Ancestors, or what was left of it. The discovery. The ceiling had fallen in places, creating tombs within tombs, but through the rubble, the adventurers saw a sight that stilled their breath. Along the remaining walls, carved into the stone, were murals. Not polished, not ceremonial, hastily scratched, desperate, unfinished, but powerful. They showed scenes of the siege in raw, aching detail. One mural depicted Grunje Stonebraid standing before a tide of black orcs, shield raised, axe swinging. Another captured Balin Firemantle, caught mid-lunge, mouth open in a furious war cry, as fire devoured the tunnel behind him. Yet another, rough, shaky but unmistakable, showed Thane Dromley standing beneath the ancestral mosaic, pulling the rune lever as the hall cracked and fell. Each carving was framed by burn marks, fingerprints of the artist who made them. "Hilda," whispered one of the rune students, tracing the lines. "These are hers." There, near the back of the hall, half buried beneath collapsed debris, they found her final work. A slab of stone about the size of a shield, perfectly etched. The crest of the Ironbreakers at the top, weathered but intact. And below it, runes carved with astonishing precision, the strokes deep and deliberate, despite the shaking hand that must have made them. They read, "Oaths kept, hold fallen, honor eternal." The dwarves stood in silence for long minutes. One began to hum, low, guttural, a funeral dirge older than any of them. Another joined, then all of them, humming as the hall seemed to breathe once more with voice. Legacy. They collected what they could. The Ironbreaker crest, Grunnies, unmistakable. A shard of the warhammer Hrondrak, its runes still faintly glowing. Burnt scraps of Balin's slayer, tattooed armor. And the stone, Hilda's testament? They would carry these relics back to Karak, and with them, the truth. The bards would sing, not of great kings or golden halls, but of the last stand of Karak Azgalok, of fire and stone, of sacrifice and flame, of a mountain that refused to kneel. And in the deepest corners of the Karak, a new mural would be carved. Songs in the stone, etched from memory and reverence. And beneath it those same final words, "Oaths kept, hold fallen, honor eternal."